are good to go, mate. We are good to go. We might as well just kick it off and get banging. You cool with that?
Yep, that's cool. Let me just share the right desktop.
Fantastic.
Hopefully you should now see a cartoon flavour of me.
Yes.
Perfect. So,
okay, guys,
so
very quick intro. Just to kind of set the scene. So good. Good afternoon now to everybody. Welcome to this DevOps Glasgow meetup in partnership with FinTech Scotland, hosted by MBN. This is part of the FinTech Scotland FinTech Scotland Fortnight. A very warm welcome to our guest, Big Rob. For those of you that are on, I've mentioned it already, chat in chat. And if you have any questions for Big Rob, stick them into the question box, please. It's very important that we keep questions away from chat because chat can get busy and we want to make sure that we can grab any questions and address them to the man himself. Rob, you're going to be talking for how long today, sir?
Hopefully no more than, I'll try and shut it down to 50, 55 minutes. We'll see. It'll be a bit of trial and error. I'm hoping to do 20, 25 minutes of slides, 20, 25 minutes of demo, and then see what questions there are. But equally questions intermingled between. So hopefully, yeah, unless you need me to cut shorter.
No, mate. We are literally here all day, and if we aim for the hour mark, then that's about perfect. What I'll do, fella, I'll just keep an eye on Q&A. You carry on doing your thing. If anything pops up in Q&A that you need to know about, I'll let you know about it. I'm now going to go on to mute, and the floor is yours, Big Rob.
Sweet, thank you very much. So, thank you for the introduction as well. As I said, Northern Rob, we'll keep for as well. So, nickname of the years is Big Rob, but equally Rob Edwards, part of the customer engineering team at Google. This session is not really a Google pitch in any shape or form. There'll obviously be some Google aspects in there. I've tried to keep it as little as pitchy as possible. So apologise if the odd time might fall into kind of sales mode. On the socials, you can find me as CLI Jockey. I actually can't remember the reason why that was my tag, but it's stuck for years. So in Google Cloud, I'm part of the application modernization and hybrid cloud specialist team within the UK. I've been involved in containerization world in some shape or form for going on 5 years. So back in the day when I was in Cisco, then through a company called Pivotal, which is now part of VMware, and now Google. So you can see there, I obviously like donuts and coffee. I'll try not to overrun. I have a habit of going off on tangents for random conversations, and also apologies for the CLI typos as I go through. Now, what I thought was I'd share some of the thoughts that I've been playing around with lately, some of the technology I've been playing around with lately, and also things that I've been helping customers. And ultimately, I'm a firm believer of picking the right level of abstraction to run workloads. And that could be running applications in VMs, running applications as functions, running them as kind of containers. It depends on the workload and picking the right level of abstraction. And I'll touch on one of those levels of abstractions today. The ultimate thing is making life easy. I'm a little bit lazy at heart. If there's an easy way of doing things, I'll pick it. And that's the way I've always worked. That's why back in the early days, I used to automate as much as possible, which was always fun in the networking world. So the premise of the talk was, how do we make Kubernetes a bit easier from kind of like a developer hat, but just generally easier and with less YAML? Anybody who's used Kubernetes for a while will realize there's a lot of YAML. And actually this morning, I don't know if anybody follows Joe Beda on Twitter. So he was one of the original project members of creating Kubernetes back in the day. And he was saying he's thinking about writing a talk entitled "I'm Sorry About All the YAML," which made me chuckle this morning and actually was pretty good timing. So, as much for the introduction, let's kind of get started. So, let's say today I've got my developer hat on. You'll see later on I probably wouldn't class myself as a good developer. I'll let you judge that based on the code you see. But let's say I've written that, or maybe added some new features to an awesome app. And all I want to do now is get it out into the hands of my users, be those customers or whatever. Because we all know the best place for apps to live is production. So I just want to get it out there. Now, things that are top of mind, there's things like, how do I deploy it? How do I upgrade it? How do I take care of the routing? So how do I get end users into my application? The deployment of software has evolved over the years. Back when I kind of started in the industry, it would be fairly common every 6 months to have that 72-hour change window, and then you'd spend 2 weeks trying to fix everything, and it was just a massive headache. Things luckily and gladly have evolved since then. We're obviously looking at a more continuous delivery of things. Another element that kind of is top of mind is that sometimes there'll be zero traffic to an application. In the middle of the night, nobody will be using it. But equally, sometimes there'll be just too much traffic. Everybody wants to kind of see this great app I've been writing or release to the world. So it's that auto-scaling characteristics. How do I make that easier? And then the management of HTTP traffic, and specifically HTTP requests, is one thing, but actually there's other ways that we build software and applications and systems, and that's more around the events. Sometimes we need to react to an event instead of responding to requests. And that I'm seeing is becoming more and more important with people when I talk to them. So in my case, I've just written a very simple stateless web app. I don't think it's going to trend on Twitter, but you never know. And that's going to be the premise of the demo I'll go through. And then there'll be a second demo, unless I'm running out of time, which will be more around the kind of eventing and based on triggers. And that'll be a bit more of a Blue Peter style, but it'll be fun. So, as I said, I just want to get my application out to the world and into the hands of users, be it updated or brand new. And everyone will start chanting Kubernetes, Kubernetes, Kubernetes. And I felt like there I was just channeling probably my inner Steve Ballmer, where I don't know if you've seen the younger folks may not have seen the clip, but certainly something that sticks in my mind is him on stage shouting developer, developer, developer for back in the Microsoft days. But so Kubernetes is great. It's the de facto platform for running containers. I love containers. We can abstract away the application from the OS. There's a whole lot of other benefits it can bring. And Kubernetes, let's be honest, is pretty ubiquitous these days. It's everywhere. And it's difficult to get away from the conversation of where Kubernetes gets inserted in some shape or form, or K8s. This talk today won't go into any massive detail around Kubernetes, or the reasons, the whys, the hows. When I need to, I'll reference to some components of Kubernetes that'll help with the conversation, but don't expect a deep dive on Kubernetes in this case. So I think of things in 2 or 3 different personas. One of them is operator, so operator hat. The other one is developer. And then the third one often is security, but security tends to kind of wear both hats anyway. So Kubernetes is great from a developer, from an operator standpoint. It's done a lot to make it easier to run containers, and just make it easy to run containers. It's got a broad reach of adoption and broad reach of features as well, and that's constantly evolving, constantly iterating. And ultimately what it's doing, I talked about abstractions earlier on. People get sick of me talking about abstractions, but it helps abstract away the complexity of running the underlying infrastructure. And some of the operator kind of use cases it solves are in the list here. So like scheduling containers, making sure they're still running, make it easy to set up load balancers, taking care of storage, and all those good things. And Kubernetes really does do a great job of improving the operator experience, certainly of years gone by. And as I said, I kind of I alluded to earlier, there's automation of networking stuff in the past. So a lot of my early career was infrastructure related, working in banks, telco, public sector. So I kind of lived a lot of the pain of the olden days, and kind of Kubernetes really does help in a lot of that kind of headaches that I originally had. Create some other headaches, but it's a different conversation. And the ubiquity of Kubernetes is appealing to developers as well, because you can deploy your workloads pretty much anywhere. However, if I put my developer hat on and think of that persona, there's a lot of things Kubernetes does, but equally there's a few things that it leaves me to start looking at. Maybe as a developer, my skill set is not around these things. A lot of the developers I speak to and I've spoken to in the past want to focus on what they're good at, which is writing code, and not really thinking about some of these other things which in the past the infrastructure and operations team used to just take care of. So things like figuring out that scaling. How do I publish those services to the internet, make them available? The setting up of logging, monitoring, and there's more and more, like in that list there's more and more things that start to move from an operational space into a developer space. And maybe that works out well for some organizations, maybe that's not so great for other organizations. Again, it comes down to choice of picking the right level of abstraction for all these things. If you're running big batch processes, Kubernetes could be actually a good position for some of these certain workloads. Kubernetes as an abstraction layer is a perfect place to run them. If we're looking at certain workloads, if the developer experience at times for Kubernetes, in my opinion, is difficult, can be painful, involves a bit of toil, and there may be a better way of doing it. Now, you may or may not have seen these tweets before. These go around all the time, but actually they do highlight the problem, or highlight a thing. And so Kelsey Hightower, if you don't know, is kind of a developer or developer relations within Google, but he's a real advocate around Kubernetes. He's written a lot of the books, literally. So he's kind of embedded in the Kubernetes space. If you don't follow him, he's well worth a follow on Twitter. There's some really interesting things he comes out with. But back in 2017, you can see there, he was talking about Kubernetes is a platform for building platforms. It's a better place to start. It's not the end game. And that's kind of true, because Kubernetes solves one of the components, and that's the orchestration of containers. However, to run an application at scale or in production requires more than just orchestrating containers. And some of that can be around consistency, meter compliance, visibility, metrics, logging, consistent view of the world, making it easy for people to get workload in and out of play. And there's a whole load of talks that are probably on YouTube around this, so it's probably as much as I'll touch on it. But what we'll see is a lot of organizations end up creating these special deploy.sh scripts to go off and deploy everything, which uses a load of kubectl, has a lot of bash magic in there, a couple of sleeps thrown in for good measure, and then embedded in a pipeline somewhere, which then starts to add to that technical debt and can be a bit painful. And if you ever look, you'll know if you've been in an organization that I've worked with, because there's probably a bash script there called Go, because why not? It's 2 letters. It's just the way I was used to deploy my automation. So in steps, this project, so back in 2018, originated from Google, but there's now over 50 different kind of organizations contributing to it. Was born something called Knative. And Knative, and this is the core component of what I'll be showing today. Knative is, in essence, a building block for serverless on top of Kubernetes. So it provides that crisp abstraction layer on top of Kubernetes to make it easier, and the focus is very much around allowing the development of software, connecting systems together, observing that software, enabling more progressive CI/CD delivery mechanisms, and just basically making a developer's life easier and more productive. So, and part of that will be abstracting away the complexity and implementation details of Kubernetes itself. And again, just focusing on what matters and making the boring and difficult parts just go away from managing Kubernetes workloads. So there's two core components to all of this. The first one I'll touch on is serving. And serving it provides the developers the logic to run the software, manage the requests, and ultimately keep that software running when it needs to be, and stops it when it doesn't. So it allows it to scale down to 0 or all the way up to whatever your cap is. It gives 3 basic building blocks around the service-centric view. So it views everything as a service. And part of that is different revisions. Unless you're lucky and you only ever write an application that's going to stay the same forever, there will be iterations, there will be revisions, there'll be new versions that come out. how do you take care of those different new versions? So there'll be multiple versions and maintaining all of that configuration. As part of that also is exposing the ingress, or exposing that to your user base and allowing them to be able to connect to that. So in this case, we've got 2 friendly users. They target the route that's been set up, whatever that DNS entry may be. And then the servicing component of Knative will make a decision of which revision the traffic is balanced to. So this could be, maybe it's just a blue-green of 50-50 goes to revision 2 and 3. Maybe actually only 1% goes to revision 2. You can start to have quite complex, useful deployment patterns. All of that configuration is kind of maintained in this third component of the configuration state. And it also takes care of that auto-scaling. So let's say there's 2 users there now, so actually I only need one pod to be running to service that load. But let's say the application does trend on Twitter and suddenly you get 100,000 people coming in. What the servicing component will do is also scale that up to meet the demand and take care of all the routing, take care of the buffering, and it uses that more metrics rather than kind of CPU type metrics. It's kind of more user-centric metrics. So that configuration component, what that will actually do is take care of working out how to implement that into Kubernetes constructs. So Knative is very much native to Kubernetes, both in spirit and actually implementation. It uses extensibility, so CRDs within Kubernetes to kind of hide a lot of that complexity of the Kubernetes constructs and kind of a different view on how to get things running. I put the in there, you'll notice there's a service mesh layer there, so I'll not go into much detail around that, but there's a component that is heavily used currently within the Knative world is Istio to serve a lot of the networking functionality. Things like certificates, TLS, etc., and also the ingress routing and a lot of the ingress controllers. However, over time, if you look at what's going on in the kind of open source project itself, a lot of that dependency on Istio is starting to kind of be merged into the Knative base. And what we've got is a controller that runs there, and it's constantly looking at the desired state, very similar to what Kubernetes does itself with regards to running containers or pods. But look at the desired state of the service, the actual state, looking, comparing them, and then decide if an action is needed, i.e. Scale up, scale down, whatever that may be. So what we have is the operators still same user experience they've always had if they've been running Kubernetes. It's the same look and feel from a Kubernetes feel perspective, same tools, same mechanisms of interacting. What the developers get is, if they need or want, they can still interact with clusters as they always have. However, it gives them a new option to start thinking of things as a service, and that service-centric view, and kind of abstracting it. And what you can actually start to do is get the best of both worlds, because actually the service mesh technologies often give you things like circuit breakers, service discovery, things that make it useful for running large workloads, and actually it still makes them available to developers to make use of while making it easy to deploy those kind of applications. So I talked pretty quickly over that. The key is often the way I tend to understand these better is just seeing is believing. So I've put some demos together. Hopefully they'll work smoothly. And the demo gods are with us, but we'll soon find out. So if I flip to, where's the right window? Hopefully that is big enough. If it's not, Robin, would you be able to shout up? But so what I've already got is my application. I've already containerized it for just speed in this case. The kind of application is already containerized. Let's see, where's my so if I look at the container registry, so if you're not familiar, this is the GCP kind of console into the world of all things GCP. I think they called it Glasgow. And we happen to have for this 3 containers that have been created and just put in the registry. So now I just want to get that running. So there's a few different ways I can use Knative to get this workload running. And a lot of this comes down to personal choice. So Knative itself has a command line, so kn, which is a whole CLI dedicated to Knative. So in this case, let's just use that to get my application running. So let's see. For ease, I have in my history. So what I'm saying here is, Knative, go. Interested in the service, go create me one. Call it meetup-kn and use this image, which is stored in my registry. What that'll go do is go and talk to the Knative processes, go and see if actually this service already exists. If it does, fine, take care of it. If it doesn't, it will go and take that and go and create the required kind of wiring to make this URL available. And what it's done, I've just let it auto create the URL. There's obviously ways to hard code that, but I've said whatever I actually call my service, which is meetup-kn, dot the actual namespace it's in, and then the domain of interest. So if I click on that, we get a lovely application up and running, which is pretty basic. As I say, it's just a stateless web app for reasons of this. So that's one of the ways we can get our applications running, and it's pretty quick and easy. That's without me even thinking about YAML, without me even thinking about how do I construct that within the Kubernetes world. Another way of deploying it is, if you're familiar with GCP, we have our own command line called gcloud, which allows you to manage everything within GCP through the CLI. Again, there's a mechanism to go and deploy your things through that way. So this is exactly the same, where you can do, it's gcloud run, deploy, I'll call it this time meetup, and this is the image version. And actually the thing that makes it interesting in this world is I can specify which platform to go and deploy it to. So I can deploy it to GKE, I can deploy it to on-prem, where I've got GKE on-prem, and equally to kind of another location where I may be running my Kubernetes platform. So this should do pretty much the same thing, just a different output. And all being well, it should create the route and direct all of the traffic to that route. So you can see here it's created a service called Meetup. The revision is 1, so I was talking about different versions. And it's deploying, so 100% of the traffic is currently getting routed to this particular instance. So if I browse to it, it's pretty much the same as what you would expect from the last one, because it's the same container image. There's a few other ways. If you are just more comfortable working with the Kubernetes interface, so kubectl, you will see there's actually, I've got created a Knative manifest. That's a terrible way of reading it, so let me just bring up the so yeah, if you're more comfortable using YAML, there's still a way of creating all of this using YAML. Obviously, the way you're specifying is the API endpoints, and you're more creating a service. And as you can see, to get this web service up, there's a lot less you need to put in. Again, it's just pointing to the container image, and this time I'll call the service YAML, meetup-YAML. So I'll go back to there, and I'll use the kubectl commands. As I said, I always have typos. It's always fun games on these. Apply -f of, what was it, Knative. So all that'll do is that'll go and create that service again, but using YAML as a kind of a way of deploying it. And the one that I came across the other day, which I actually thought was really quite interesting, and is if you are a big fan of Terraform, actually there's a Terraform provider plugin to allow you to, where is it? Terraform. So actually I could use Terraform to go and deploy my workloads. It looks pretty early days. It's not as feature parity, doesn't have feature parity like the CLI and the kind of directly interacting with the Kubernetes cluster, but I actually thought it was quite an interesting Terraform apply. I think it was quite an interesting addition. Yes, and I'll go and create that using Terraform, and again, do exactly the same as all those other ways of creating the service. So while it's doing that, there is another way of doing it is through the console and through the UI. I'll show you that in a second. In fact, no, I'll show you that now. Nope, console. So if I go to, so in the Google World, the Knative implementation of the API is something called Cloud Run. So I can view all the services I've created. As confidently, it's that moment of everything freezes. I don't know if anybody else does this. When anybody's looking or you're doing a demo, you end up hitting refresh more and more, as if that's going to suddenly make it better. I'm hoping it's still got me logged in. Okay, while that's coming up in the background, I'll just go back. There we go. And what you can see here is it's created those services that I was talking about earlier. So Meetup YAML, Terraform, the Knative way, and through the G Cloud. If I want to create a service, I can just do it through the UI. But I'll come back to that later on as part of the kind of how we can help automate it and streamline this even further. So if I go back to the CLI, I mean, I spend a lot of time in CLI, and kind of I mentioned earlier that there's a few different ways of interacting with Knative. So you'll notice I've created a few things, but it never actually gave me the URL. So let's say, how do I get to see what's been created? So the Knative CLI itself, there's a few different kind of additions of service revision root. Again, the same with G Cloud, there's a similar thing. So I could do a KN service. We already know, should just say list. So it gives us a list of all the services that have been created and that are running, along with URLs and useful information. Again, you can go into service and then describe. If you're used to the Kubernetes CLI, this will feel and look very similar. There's no surprise with that, I guess. Let's just pick up Meetup, because that's the main one I'll be looking at, so we can get a bit more detail into that particular service. Again, there's G Cloud to do a similar thing, so run services list. Again, it's listing the same sort of stuff, just a slightly different format. And then the interesting one is kubectl. As I said, it's using extensions and the extensibility of Kubernetes itself. So actually, I can use kubectl commands and do a get k service, and that pulls back that information again. And you'll notice very similar to that kn output. Again, you can also see from the Kubernetes CLI, get revisions. You would have thought I'd learned to type better over these years, but I seem to be getting worse. And kind of, again, a similar sort of output of the different revisions that are available. As we know, there's only 3 because I've only deployed 3 things so far. 2 seconds, just open the door. The dog's frantically trying to get in because he wants to see this as well. So that's kind of easy way of deploying the workloads. So now what happens if I want to kind of auto scale? So if I look here, I'm just going to do a get pods. You'll notice that all of the pods that were originally running, so from Meetup, from KN, and from YAML, are currently being terminated. So that was just a kubectl get pods, and I put it with a watch to constantly refresh. We can see there that it's actually terminating those pods. The reason it's doing that is because I've set the auto, or I've not even set it. It's kind of the default thing with auto scaling. It's just going to tear everything down unless it's needed. So now I'm going to do, with a useful little command I've come across called hey, I'm just going to fire 150,000 requests at that URL. And what we should see, as it's doing that, it's going to create a whole load of containers to meet that demand, or a whole load of pods to meet the demand of that request. And that's just going to take care of it automatically. And what we can see there, while that's running, it takes like a minute and a half, but what we can see as well from, if we drill into the UI itself, one of the things I said is key is around metrics, and you can start to get visibility. I've not really set up too many dashboards on this, so I'll just use the out-of-the-box view of metrics. And clearly I've been playing around this morning to make sure that the demo would roughly work. But if I drill it down to the last hour, we start to see data around requests, the kind of latency time, and also the container increase count. So we can see there how it's kind of shooting up and down, the CPU usage, and just things that are useful metrics. There's a lot more metrics you can get out of it, but that's just kind of gives you the idea. Again, we can also see the revisions, which in this case is only one. We'll see a few more in a few seconds. And the thing that is interesting is a lot of this was created with CLI. Under all of this is actually more YAML. So I did promise you less YAML, but equally there is YAML if that's the way you want to interact with Knative. And again, it's more of that kind of service-centric view of the world. So the look and feel is very similar to how you would do Kubernetes YAML. It just abstracts a load of the complexity away. But what this is useful if you want to take this that's running in GCP and you want to go and run it on your own environment, you could just kind of reuse this YAML. So that has not finished, but let's just kill it. So that's great. I've got my application running. I can now go to scale up and down, but actually I want to change it. Realistically, nothing stays still, so I want to change this. So I'm going to do you may have noticed there was 3 container images earlier. So actually what I want to do is go and deploy the blue version of that container. So let's go and I'm going to update the service. And by default, I've just left it to take 100% of the traffic because I'm uber confident that this container is going to work. What's the worst that could happen? So now if I browse to that, it's serving 100%. It kind of gets into my theme of I love a brew, but actually coffee is more my drink and tea, so this isn't the one I wanted. Right, I want to roll that back. Okay, so how do I get rid of that and back to how we were? So I want to go back to my, where are we? I want to go back to the revisions here. And actually, let me just refresh it. I want to manage that traffic and say, actually send 100% of the traffic back to version 1 because I've clearly made a mistake. So now if we go back here, it's been updated back to version 1, we've lost the teacup. Great. So how do I roll this out in a better way? So one of the ways is, and you'll notice I default to G-Cloud just because I'm more familiar with it because it's what I use on a more regular basis. So now if I do a deploy slightly differently, so I'll say this time I'm going to deploy the green container that I have. There's a play on blue-green there. You'll notice that there is the beta flag there. This is just a beta CLI that I'm using specifically to allow me to actually tag these images in a better way. So I'm going to tag it as green. And actually what I'm going to say is, don't send any traffic. Get it up and running, but don't direct any traffic to it yet. What this will do is then go and create that container image, get it running, and then allow me to then test it. So actually it said, you notice I call it tag green. You'll notice the green dash meetup. Great, let's see what that looks like. So although the rendering's a little off, it's got a coffee cup. You know what? I'm happy. Let's get that rolled out. But I don't want to just roll it out big bang and kind of get it to all users. I want to start drip feeding into kind of my user base. So also if I do a cloud run services meetup, we can see the setup a bit more. We've got 100% of the traffic going to revision 1, 0 going to revision 4, but we've got a DNS entry or a root set up for that green tag. Great. So okay, let's go and alter that bit. Let's go and say I want to direct 20% of my traffic to the green tag. So what I'm saying here is, on the services, go and update the traffic for service meetup to specifically a tag called green, and just give it 20% of that load. What that'll do is Knative will take care of working out how to implement that in Kubernetes. And as you can see, it's saying 80% of the traffic will go to the revision 1, 20% to green. So if I go back to my original, is that the right one? Yeah, we should start to see the coffee cup starts dropping, which we did a few seconds ago. There should be another one drops in any second. There we go. Okay, great. I'm happy with that. I'm happy with how that's running. Actually, I want to look at that describe again, and we can start to see the output there. It's kind of splitting the traffic. Again, similar to the output you just saw a few seconds ago. So now actually I want to do 30%, maybe 40%, and kind of slowly drop this up, and maybe have an automated process to do this based on metrics or various other things, but it's really easy to just kind of start to redirect traffic. And then actually, I just want to say, if I can use the flag to latest, and this will just direct all that traffic to my latest instance, which is green. So now if I go back to this app, everything should be green coffee cup in the bottom corner. Brilliant. So that's interacting with the CLI. That's useful. The bit that I find really interesting is, let's say, ultimately as a developer, I've probably got that in a repo somewhere. And maybe I want to create this and have this set up with an automated pipeline. So I'll go to the UI. I talked about creating a service via the console. Again, this can all be through CLI. But for this case, I'm going to say, I've got two options of Cloud Run. There's one where it's fully managed, where you don't have the ability to interact with Kubernetes. You kind of take care of all that heavy lifting. The other one is to run it on a Kubernetes cluster, or Anthos is the kind of branding for us Google to give a platform based around Kubernetes. So I'm going to say, go deploy it in my cluster that I called run, which is the one we've been using. And let's, let's put it in the same namespace as before. And let's call this meetup pipeline. Pipe. I've got an option to say, and I was talking about earlier around eventing and sourcing, or serving, sorry. So if I'm serving, it's going to be front end, it's probably going to be for external traffic. If you want to start using for kind of events and things like that, you start to configure it to be internal. And there's a whole load of authentication you can put around that. Now, I could specify the container image, but hey, I'm not a fan of playing around with Docker files. I'm sure there's an easier way of doing that. And actually, I'd rather have it linked directly to my my Git repo. So I can say, okay, let's use Cloud Build, which just happens to be the CI tool within Google. So I'll say pick GitHub, and my app is called Meetup Glasgow DevOps. And then actually I can say, use a Docker file I've already used, or use something called build packs. So build packs, which is a whole different talk, something that has excited me for the last few years, is the ability to take the raw source code and automatically detect what the language is, create the container image for it, and there's a whole load of other benefits. But it basically, every time I do a commit to my Git repo, the build packs will take care of containerizing the image, and then the pipeline will automatically push this to Knative or Cloud Run in this case. And that'll just continually, based on any commits, it'll just take care of kind of deploying the service. So that will ultimately create. However, it's a bit like watching paint dry, so I'll go back to I'll go back to the slides. I don't know if I'll pause now to see if there's any questions on any of that, because it's kind of a whistle-stop tour so far. I guess there wasn't any.
One question from earlier, Rob, and it was from Jim. If you just jump into Q&A, there's a question earlier on there from Jim.
So the question is from Jim, is Knative cloud agnostic for self-hosted and cloud-managed Kubernetes clusters? Yes. So if you, within GCP, there's an easy tick box to say deploy Knative capabilities on top of my GK instance. However, if I've got my own Kubernetes cluster somewhere, the knative.dev site has got a whole load of instructions for how to deploy it. The key benefit of Knative is well, there's a few of them, but one of them is that actually it doesn't care who owns or where the Kubernetes cluster is, as long as it's got the ability to interact with Kubernetes. There's some kind of minimum requirements or versions, etc., but it will embed into any Kubernetes deployment. Okay, so I kind of, the talk title may have been a little misleading. It may not have been. I did promise less YAML, but there's now a whole set of new YAML. But you can see it's a different way of thinking about how to deploy your application or your workloads. Rather than thinking of it in infrastructure components with like pods, replica sets, how will it be deployed, ingress, all of the YAML set up the TLS, or just kind of set up the routing, all of that stuff. Rather than thinking about all of that, there's three things you'll think about. One of them is the service, specifically the configuration of that service, how you balance traffic, what the service would look like, and what revisions of your application there are and how you make use of those revisions. And then Knative will take care of kind of this layer. In some cases, as I said, Kubernetes may be the perfect layer of abstraction to interact and deploy services, but for a lot of services, there's an easier path, is what I'm trying to hint at here. So this is where we left off before. So to add on to this, there's now the second part of Knative, and that's the eventing bit. So this is very much based on providing the ability to express connections between different pieces of software through events. So you can compose these in like really flexible pipelines, or they can actually be quite complex processing pipelines you can set up with a whole load of discrete kind of events or things that will kick off based on a trigger. So there's two components really to the eventing side of things. There's a broker and trigger. So the broker kind of exists to manage the flow of events, and then the trigger will happen based on the detection of a thing. So it could be the filter saying, do a thing if you see this. There's different ways of interacting with this. There's kind of the sources of all this. There's a whole load of things that could be used as part of the eventing. So webhooks, maybe even direct HTTP requests, gRPC, basically anything that admits a cloud event. So the broker could be used to trigger a thing and do some other code. So a bit like functions, you could think, but able to use whatever language you want in a reusable container format. So it allows you to loosely couple event-driven systems with kind of higher level objects. And it can scale from just a handful of containers through to kind of live streaming pipelines and kind of really intensive things. And there's kind of interacts with a whole lot of things. So if you look on the .dev site, or even the Google pages, there's 30+ event sources and services. The one that I spend a lot of time with is the GCP PubSub, but it's pretty pluggable implementation. So there's PubSub, there's Kafka, there's in-memory. As I said, have a look at the documentation to see what's available out of the box, or actually maybe connect to create your own kind of interaction or integration, which could be fun. So back to the demo, and this will be, rather than me showing you how to deploy these things, it's just a quick demo to show you it in action. So what this will be is, and it uses another component which I quite like within GCP, but it's a whole different conversation again. So in this case, I've got two storage buckets. One where I will drop a file, and one which is the output of going through some sort of processing. The cloud storage then publishes a message that, hey, I've got a new file onto the PubSub, so it's a message queue. Then PubSub will then push that message to the Cloud Run service, so that the service that I've got running, that'll go and do a thing based on this event. The service then looks at the image, and it'll do a quick analysis on it. So it uses the Google Vision API, so it'll do a quick analysis on it to see what the image is. And if it's violent, if it has some content that we don't want, what it will go and do is go and blur that image and then push it out to the other storage bucket. However, if it meets none of those requirements and it's actually an image of a fluffy cat or a dog, or it's not violent, it will just allow it to go straight into the other, it will just move it straight into the other storage bucket. So if I go to, so let me show you, I've got these two buckets open already. So there's two buckets just to show you there's nothing in there. I'll refresh them. So there's two buckets. One of them is Big Rob image, process in, so that's the container of the storage bucket I'll drop it into. And then there's the one that's called blurred, which probably should be post-processing, but hey. So if I go to the CLI, I'm gonna what I want to do, just upload it quickly. So there's a CLI tool just to upload my image into the Google storage bucket. So I'll just do that. Then just to show you what it looks like, it's just a simple zombie eating a human, as you would expect. Then the code itself, if I look at it, and this is, I can't actually say this is my code, I lifted it off one of the kind of labs within Google, but it's basically, it's a Python application that's running. It could be any language, and actually the tutorial for doing this has the option of Node, Java, whatever language. Ultimately, the benefit of this is if you can containerize it, you can run it as a Knative service. There are some limitations that are going on in the end, but it's basically a Python application that I'll say, based on the event, go and kind of have a look at the image, and then there's image processing. I can share the links to this afterwards rather than trying to talk through the code here, but ultimately it'll take the image and then push it to the blurred bucket. So now if I look at the bucket, if we refresh again, if the demo god is still with me, that should now have an image dropped in there. Called zombie.png. Let's just pull it down. As you can see, I've done it a few times. And it's basically just blurred the image using Image Magic plugin as part of the Python script. And if we look back in Cloud Run, all that's doing is, back to the services. This is the Blue Peter moment where I already had this service running. So it's called PubSub. And you should be able to see the metrics around it kind of periodically being used. I think is that updated for now? Let's just refresh it. But you get the idea. You can start to see when those events happen and the frequency and how heavily used they are. As you can see, I don't use this very much because I created it specifically for this demo. So back to the slides. Just have a quick check if there's any Q&A. No. Okay, so conscious of the 7 minutes. Now, amazingly, after I'd created this deck, I discovered one of our developer relations people. She'd created this pretty awesome kind of sketch pad of Cloud Run being the Google implementation of Knative, which I actually thought I could have replaced my whole presentation. But hey, have a look. She's done a whole load of really cool kind of sketch notes at thecloudgirl.dev. It's well worth a look. But the key thing is I thought, I can share this and also use it as a talking point to explain kind of and summarize what we've done. So Knative brings benefits of making it easier to serve content and applications to users. It also helps with that eventing and real-time processing of things. Actually, you can start to chain different kind of Knative pods together and have quite a complex workflow. In essence, what Knative or Cloud Run is doing is automating and making it easier for developers to build solutions on top of on top of Kubernetes. As I said, the Knative experience within Google Cloud is something called Cloud Run. There's actually 2 different flavors. One of them is completely fully managed. You only have the Knative API to interact with. And then the other one is with Anthos as part of the kind of platform to make it easier to run Kubernetes with all the kind of compliance, policy management, monitoring, and all the stuff you would expect as part of that platform. Going back to Kelsey Hightower's tweet earlier. what you can start to do is some of the stuff we've done as well is have kind of local emulation. So if you use VS Code or IntelliJ, you can start to have local emulation of Cloud Run, build in workflows, just make it easier to integrate with GCP generally. And as I said, if you're using it on top of the Kubernetes cluster itself, you can start to interact with the service mesh more using auto discovery capabilities, config map integration. But the key thing is ultimately it makes whatever you deploy as a Knative service portable to run in any other Knative service. Now, some workloads it works much better with. So web services, so websites, RESTful API, the backend, back office administration. That's kind of where the sweet spot is. Equally, automation of kind of workflow orchestration, maybe something like scheduling a document generation based on a thing, or kind of event-driven reactive automation. Or data processing is also a common use to make it easier to consume and make use of data for analytics purposes. And also connecting with their cloud services, maybe as an operational thing. Maybe you've got an event based on a certain alert or event, go do this thing or go page whatever or go do whatever it may be. Now, it's not fit for all, and I kind of alluded to that a few times, where maybe the Kubernetes construct is a better abstraction layer. Actually, maybe a VM is a better abstraction layer. So things that are stateful applications are not a good fit for these, or applications that need to interact with lower level abstractions. And a good example of that is storage for the stateful applications, so PVCs, etc., but also networking. So if you've got an application that needs to use non-standard TCP ports or UDP ports or have multiple ports, then it probably isn't a good fit for Knative and Cloud Run. And actually, the Kubernetes construct is maybe the quickest and best way to kind of get your workloads deployed. And that's a wrap. So hopefully it's given you a little insight into Knative and how it's kind of making life a bit easier for users of Kubernetes. And somehow I managed to keep on time, which is almost a miracle with me.
You get, firstly, undying praise for staying on time, but secondly, your name will be spoken of in the gods for using an image of a zombie in your presentation, mate. First time I've seen brilliant stuff. Okay, so everybody out there in chat, it's almost time to wrap here, but I reckon we'll get Rob here for another couple of minutes. Anybody has any more questions that they would like to ask at this stage? Give it a little minute just in case somebody's slow in typing, Rob.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, if you don't want to type on the message here, feel free to reach out to me on the old socials. If you've got any feedback on it at all as well, feel free to feed that through.
Brilliant, mate. This has been recorded, so the presentation will be available on the Meetup group webpage and your socials. If you just want to just mention your socials again, Rob, for anybody to reach out. I know I found you on LinkedIn, fella. You're not hard to find.
LinkedIn is one of them, but anything with CLI Jockey. Usually Twitter is my best place to go for technical stuff. If you're interested in me lifting gym and coffee, Instagram's kind of CLI Jockey. GitHub CLI Jockey. There's a theme, CLI Jockey. I can't remember why that came about, but hey, I stuck to it.
All right, fantastic. So remember that one, guys. It's at CLI Jockey if you want to talk techie with Rob. Rob, all remains for me to say is thank you very much for giving up your time today, fella. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with the community, mate. It is very much appreciated. Massive thanks for sticking to time and for using a zombie picture.
My pleasure. Anytime.
And for all you guys out there in chat, thank you for taking part. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for getting involved. Thank you very much. See you all again next time. Take care.
Ciao, ciao.